It's because PowerPoint is lying to me. That's the problem. So open the sharing tray. Start that. That should, in theory, be a PowerPoint presentation.
That's it. That's the one.
That's it. Yeah, you're fine now. You're good. You're golden.
Finally. Right. Hello, everybody. To those of you that haven't met me before, I'm Tim Bishop. I have a long and weird background in IT. Before that, I was a military aviator. When people ask me what I do these days, I just tell them I'm a software engineer because it's easier. That was the actual answer until 2015 when I relocated from Iceland to the UK. Since then, I've been in roles that combine leadership and technology, typically things like CTO or head of software. And I have been a certified Scrum Master and working in Agile for the last 11 years. For the last 4 years, I've been contracting as an Agile coach and a Scrum Master. So that means I can say lots of words about Agile in various forms. It absolutely does not mean I'm always right. And it absolutely does not mean I have stopped learning. I'm learning more about this every single day. So what we are going to do is have a think about how we can use Agile principles plus a few sort of basic rules of physics of projects, if you like, to deal with these really tricky scenarios of fixed price projects. The caveat here is that I'm absolutely not an expert in these. I've dealt with them a little bit. I understand how they work, and I would expect that everybody has their own variances on them. So please jump in. I think if I do that, no, I can't see people. So please just shout. I'm not going to see if hands go up. So please just shout. Please feel free to interrupt me at any stage. I will be taking questions at the end. Is that okay?
Perfect.
What we're going to cover is we're going to talk about two-ish principles that underlie project of all types. Then we're going to talk about some gotchas. Then we're going to talk about a handful of what I call coping mechanisms, which is my way of saying tricks that you can possibly use to help you overcome these problems. Then I have some references, and then some Q&A. Let's dive straight in. So, see, I was going to say put your hands up if you know about the iron triangle. Is there anybody on the call who doesn't know about the iron triangle? Anybody? Yes, no?
Yes, I don't know about it. Awesome.
Yay! I don't care if you're actually lying or not. So the iron triangle is, I mention it because it's super important in project management, and it's also not that well known. It's basically the rules of projects. And what it says is that there are three main aspects to project. The timescale, typically expressed through deadlines or stage gates. The scope, which is what you want to achieve as opposed to the how. And then I've put in quotes resources because I have a bit of a bugbear about this. If you go and Google iron triangle, you'll get a lot of pictures that look exactly like this. And instead of resources, they put cost or money there. I've put resources in quotes because within the context of, in particular, software projects, even if they are implementation rather than software engineering projects, resources becomes people. So it's people and skills. I have worked with a lot of organizations that do this horrible thing of using the word resources when they mean people, but it doesn't matter. So you've got time, scope, and resources. And the way it works is if you pin one corner of the triangle, you can only change one of the others. So the classic case is if you say, right, we're going to pin the time, we must achieve the project on this particular date. That means the only way you can do it is either throw more people at it or possibly more money at it or reduce the scope. If you say, right, we need to deliver all of that scope by that time, theoretically, the only way you can achieve it is to throw more money or more people at it. If you tried to do that, so you've got, right, a deadline, then you've got a bunch of stuff you want to deliver on the deadline, and you've put a bunch of people on it, and all of a sudden something really unheard of like a global pandemic happens. All of a sudden you can throw as many people as or you can try to throw people at it. It ain't going to work. If you're going to hit the deadline, you need to reduce scope. If you want to deliver all of the scope, you've got to change your deadline. So there's an interplay between those three things. Are there any questions about those fundamentals? I've gone super fast through it there. So are there any questions before we move on?
That makes sense. It's a little bit like when you're building applications, isn't it?
Yes.
You can have visit performance and resilience
Oh,
and all that. Yeah.
And by the way, very, very few Agilists will talk about this, but it's this iron triangle that underlies basically Scrum, because what Scrum does is it pins the time one strictly, and it also pins the resources one. So it says, right, time, we're going to do sprints. So it's either 2, 3, or 4 weeks. We pin the resources one by assuming that the people in the team, or the capacity for production within the team, is fixed. Therefore, what we do is we do a sprint planning at the end of every sprint, because all we're changing is scope. And this is why Scrum works, because it accepts the time is fixed. It accepts that the working capacity is fixed. And then all we do is we have long and detailed and hopefully well-informed conversations about what we can achieve within a couple of weeks. Okay, any more questions? Cool. Right, here's a question for everybody then. On your picture, you can see 2 pictures. On the left, sorry, 2 projects, I beg your pardon. On the left-hand side, I'm building a patio out the back of Dylan's house, because that wooden decking of his has gone rotten. What we've got on his drive, much to his wife's pleasure, is a huge, great pile of bricks. On the right-hand side, I need to get from Bristol Temple Meads to go up to Paddington before 9:10 tomorrow morning. There is one fundamental difference between these 2 projects. What is it, please?
Fixed time.
Nice answer, but no. What's the difference between those 2 projects?
Location.
No, it's the correct one. Okay, let's think about resources here. So if I wanted to move that pile of bricks to the back garden, what's the fastest way I could do that? Let's assume you can't get mechanical operators, diggers down the back or anything. What's the fastest way to move that pile of bricks down the back garden?
Manually.
Exactly. And if I was doing it on my own, how could I make it go faster? Well, you would do what we used to do on board the ships. So you would have a chain of about 20 or 30 people stretching from the pile of bricks through to the back garden, and you would do that whole daisy chain thing where one person passes the brick to the next person. Basically, what you do is you throw an awful lot of people at the challenge, and it would get done super fast. I mean, that pile of bricks, if you had 30 people there, you could probably do that in 10 minutes. If I did it on my own, it would take me an hour and a half. So how can I get from Bristol Temple Meads to London Paddington in less than 1 hour and 38 minutes with trains? You can't. The key trick here is that I can't get from Bristol to London on 2 trains in an hour, half of 1 hour, 38 minutes. In the same way that you can't have a baby in 4.5 months with 2 women. It doesn't work like that. So on the left-hand side, we've got an example of the type of task that does respond to throwing more resource at it. On the right-hand side, what you've got is a classic illustration of the type of task that simply cannot be shortened by throwing resources at it. You can't have a baby in 3 months with 3 women. The reason I mention this is that within traditional project management, there are a couple of assumptions about how projects work. Number one is that almost everything is estimable to a very high degree of accuracy. In other words, you can make your estimates and it's going to be accurate. That's simply not, I mean, that might be true if you're stacking Lego blocks or whatever. It absolutely is not true when it comes to the vagaries of software engineering. The other big assumption is that if you take any piece of work, you can make it go faster by throwing more people at it. And it simply is not true for software. And this is why, by the way, all those horror stories that you see in the press about IT projects failing are so common. It's because people take traditional project management skills, try to apply them to software engineering, and they fall foul of, well, many things. But the 2 biggest things that they fall foul of is assuming that they can predict when something's going to be done, and assuming that if inevitably it isn't done because no plan survives contact with the enemy, then they assume that they can catch up by throwing resource at it, and it just doesn't work like that. And in fact, the next slide gives us a classic example of this. So there's a wee bit of a story with this. About 4 years ago, I was working as CTO in a little digital mapping company in Bath, and we were growing super fast. We had a really important project that involved saving Star Alliance 10 million euros a year by making technology that nobody thought was possible. And the board were constantly badgering me to go faster and go faster. And they were constantly hiring more people because they thought it would make us go faster. Over the course of about 6 months, what we spotted was that from the moment when a new engineer started in the dev team, the sprint velocity would dip by about 20 to 30% for about 2 to 3 sprints, and then it would come back up. And I had those numbers in a spreadsheet, but it was a little bit anecdotal, and as we know, the plural of anecdote is not evidence. And I then went out onto the internet and I found this picture, which I brutally plagiarized, and it turns out it's quite a well-known thing, which means yes, so there's 2 categories. Firstly, you can only have a difference, an impact on the types of work that respond to throwing resource at it. And secondly, if you're lucky enough to have the type of work that will respond to it, don't expect to have a response immediately. In fact, you're going to have a decline. So what? What does this mean? Why are we talking about the theory? Well, it really boils down to, at the start of your project, a couple of things. Control of your estimation and control of the scope of your project are pretty much everything here. Now, I'm going to talk through, this is where I'd like the audience to jump in, please. I'm going to talk through what I think is my experience of the normal sort of life cycle of a fixed cost project. If yours differs from that, please jump in and interrupt. If I get it wrong, please tell me. Is that okay? Are there any questions before I do that?
Okay, sure.
Cool. So company goes out, puts in a bid to get the work, and during the bidding process there might be a bit of back and forwards, but there'll be a point at which you have said to the potential customer, we can deliver this scope for this much money. And if you get the deal, they are then expecting you to deliver that scope or almost all of it for that much money. You might have some buffers in there. If you get the work, then if you get awarded the contract, then the real work starts. And immediately that you get the contract, there's going to be a couple of phases that start here. First is the discovery phase, and that's going to be going into detail about what is actually going to be delivered and then hopefully what's not going to be delivered. And then there's going to be another phase of estimation there, potentially breaking it down into lumps and checking in en route. Does that sound like a typical fixed cost project to everybody? Have I got anything wrong there?
So no, that does sound pretty reasonable. Sometimes what we do is we have a paid for discovery phase.
Yes.
Which is fixed price, and then we we use that to then come up with a fixed price.
Okay.
We try not to have a fixed price, but yeah.
So you're basically increasing, I'm paraphrasing you here, correct me if I get it wrong, you're increasing your ability to effectively quote for the deal or put in the right shape of tender by doing a discovery phase, but for commercial reasons it's great if you can get it paid for. Have I got that right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, great. Okay, so what that means then is that there's going to be a point.
Dylan on mute. I think Dylan's.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Go, Dylan.
I was going to say, one of the reasons you might want to pay is effectively it commits them to doing so. So if you effectively did a discovery phase, which would take 5 days if it was a complicated project or more, and then they said, okay, we don't like the quote, and walked away, you've just spent 5 days on something you can't recoup. If you say, look, it's going to cost you this much to do a discovery phase, then you're testing their level of commitment. So there's actually a very good argument for making them pay for discovery.
Yeah, sometimes there's a sort of a Veblen good thing going on there as well, where the more you can charge for your discovery phase, the more sort of the more credible you look. That's quite an interesting scenario. Okay, so either of those I'm familiar with, but what it means is that at some point in time, between you and the customer, you're going to get a list of stuff what needs to be delivered, and you may or may not have fixed timescales on it, but you're certainly going to have a fixed cost on it. That means that from the point of view of the people delivering it, you've got a strong incentive to get that right. So let's move on to a few methods that are going to help us get this right. Now, I'm absolutely not saying that all of these methods are going to work. I was just hoping to introduce them to you. If you've seen them before, let me know. If you've used them, let me know. If you think they're nonsense, please let me know. But these are all things that I've used quite a lot. So we've got the Moscow method, we've got ordered backlogs, value frameworks, and daily stand-ups, and a little bit extra as well. And we'll go through each of those in turn. Probably the most powerful question that I ever ask, either as a consultant or particularly as an Agile coach or a Scrum Master, is can it wait? Which means, do you absolutely need this thing now, or can it wait until later? And one of my favorite things about repeated can it wait questions is that it's like a bubble sort, basically. The important stuff will stick and the less important stuff will bubble down. And Moscow is kind of a formalization of that. So there's a couple of different ways of doing it. If we think of it in terms of features that could be put into a product, or perhaps within the context of a fixed price project, you may well even have done this at the start. It might be in the bid, but if not, it would be useful to do it early. So these are the features that the system must have, the things that they should have, but might not be there in the initial version. Then the things they could have, but probably won't be in initial versions. And then arguably the most powerful bit here is clarification of the things that definitely will not be in there. Are there any questions about that? So the most obvious thing in there, and I've run into this recently actually, because I was doing some workshopping with somebody at HL, and one of the people in the room was really, really picky about this, and we ended up having about half an hour or more of conversation about the exact definition of what is must have, what is should have, and what is could have. And we got there in the end, but we couldn't really do it without talking about versioning. So arguably one of the most important things you need to think about here in terms of a fixed price project is to say, if we're doing must have, should have, could have, and won't have, are we talking about the whole project? Are we talking about project phases? You might not have phases. If you have, it's great. Are we talking about versions of the software? Don't know, but it's got to be put within that sort of temporal framework of the project. If we're then thinking in terms of tasking, the haves become do's, and I've got a personal example of this. This is from a few months ago. So I use Google Keep Notes a lot, and here I am doing it in my own world. So things that I must do, and this was my list for the week. Things I must do this week, things I should do this week, things I could do this week, and things I won't do this week. So that's the Moscow. Best use of it is, I found it's really good for structuring your thinking about what can be left out of the requirement. Any thoughts about that? Any questions? Anybody used it, by the way? It's a bit of an unfashionable name at the moment, but I'm ploughing on regardless.
Oh, yeah, Moscow, we've used it. We've used it particularly when actually the scope of work is humongous and the cost of it is humongous. Like, they're thinking it's 200 grand and we're looking at going it's 500 grand, and so
what's
then
the typical output of that? Do you manage to strip it down?
We strip it down a bit, but no, not by much.
Yeah,
but then it's still, at least they've been through that process to kind of go, actually, no, you really want this stuff, and here's the value.
Yeah.
So you're leading me into my next slide really, really beautifully. So when I say the words 80% in about 35 seconds time, shout at me, please, because you're leading me into that beautifully. Dill, did you have a point there?
I was just going to say that the will it wait question is really powerful, actually.
I agree.
I've not thought of asking in that way. I'm definitely something I was going to think of. We definitely use Moscow, but to be quite so interrogative and say, will it wait, like that, it crystallizes.
And what you can do is you can soften that by, and because a lot of people, you can say, can it wait? And they'll go, oh yeah, fine. And they'll just laugh very easily. But if you sense that going in a really interrogative fashion like that is going to get their backs up, what you can say is you can gently introduce the concept of an MVP to people. You can gently introduce the concept of phasing. And you can say, for example, okay, the way we can increase our chance of success here is to slip as much into phase 2 or 3 or to Q3 or whatever as we possibly can. So can that thing wait a wee bit? And you'll probably get a positive response to that.
Yeah, I'm thinking of some projects where it's laughable that the MVP is 90% of the product, and you think in the last two phases.
Well, that might be an MVP, but it's a maximum, not a minimum.
Yeah, they just don't say what the M means.
Exactly. Right. Any more questions before we move on to the next slide? Right. So I make no apology about the fact that the next 3 slides relate to ordered backlogs, and that is because it is such a powerful concept. It is so central to Agile delivery, and it's the way that stuff gets done. The concept of ordered backlogs, along with what I said at the start about pinning resource and pinning time and only working around scope, putting that together with ordered backlog is basically the alchemy of why Agile works so well. So I'm going to dig into a bit of detail here. If I lose you, please shout immediately, but it's so important. I don't want to skimp on it. So here's a theoretical scenario. Let's imagine we're doing any type of delivery project. And what we're going to do now is plot how the value gets delivered. Don't worry about the fact that I'm not defining value. I'm about to get to that. But think in your own minds what value means to you or could mean to you. So most projects have a point at which the return on investment goes to virtually 0. And if you keep saying to people, can it wait, they'll say, actually, it can. So, Simon, thank you for shouting.
Sorry, yes.
Yeah, well, it's my fault. It was more than 35 seconds. If you think back over the handful of projects that you've delivered recently, what's been the relationship between what they thought was in scope at the start and what was actually delivered in phase 1? I'm asking in a roundabout way, is my 80% accurate?
Sometimes that could be, it might be high actually.
Oh, right, yeah.
Yeah, that might be a bit high, but yeah, there's definitely less. It's never 100%.
Exactly. That's that. I'm really pleased that you said that bit actually, because my example here assumes that it basically assumes it's not 100%. I've put the 80% there, if I'm going to be completely open with you, to make the graphics look good, and it's also a bit of my experience as well. So let's assume in our little model here that 80% is the cutoff line. If we put all the individual lumps of value, so call them features or capabilities or user stories, whatever you want, all the little strips of value, if you chew through those in whatever order you want without ordering them by value, then your rate of delivery is going to be broadly linear and you're going to cross the 80% line around about there. If, however, you deliver them by delivering the most valuable things first and ensure that you're always delivering the next most valuable thing, your initial rate of delivery of value is much, much higher. You can see that the curve is much steeper at the start. And what that means is that you're going to be crossing that 80% point much earlier in time. That's really important because you've got this huge, great chunk in the middle there, which means you're getting results much earlier. You're saving time and money. And in fact, last time I did this slide, I was doing it to a heavily regulated organization. And instead of saying earlier results there, it said earlier compliance because compliance matters to people like that. And of course, if you're thinking about let's say, for example, you were producing an app or a website or a product, that's your competitive advantage because it means you've got 80% of your value out into the user's hands a long time before you would have had if you were only using an unordered backlog. The one point that could go in there, but I deliberately didn't put in there, but to not clutter it up, was that the faster you deliver value, the earlier you're going to be able to get feedback from your users as well. And we're going to talk about feedback in a few minutes. Are there any questions about that slide? Unlike a lot of my other things, it's not plagiarized and it's actually true. Okay, so now we get a little bit mathematical. This is where it gets magical here. In the book Twice the Work in Half the Time, the seminal work about Scrum, he talks about this, and this is my own version of it. Right, so what we've got here, can you see my mouse pointer, by the way? Oh, I think I can.
No, we can't see it. No, you can do a laser pointer.
Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Right. So here is a list of. Can I annotate?
Should be able to annotate.
Highlight. Right. Here is a list of tasks A through to J, which I think is 10. What I've done. This is quite a contrived scenario, and I have contrived it to make the numbers look good. So I don't mind admitting that. But we've given each of the tasks their value. So the most valuable one is 100 points, the least valuable one is 10 points, and of course it's a linear move down. From here all the way through, you've got a bunch of different scenarios. So in the first scenario, we only deliver task A, then we deliver task A and B, then we deliver task A, B, and C, and then in the final one, we deliver, I think, what is it, 9 of them or something. So you can see this row here is showing us the proportion of the work that we've done. Now, this model makes 2 huge assumptions mathematically, but it's still, I personally think, quite relevant. Hang on a minute, I'm going to see if I can move this. Bear with. There we go, that's better. My little block was in the way of the numbers. Yeah, so there we are. Boom, there we are, back to the pen. So let's look at this one. If we only do the first one, we've delivered 18% of the value, because we've delivered a huge, great lump of value up there. We've delivered a 100-pointer. And the assumption is that each of the tasks, A through to J, will take us exactly the same amount of effort to do. Because there are very, very often scenarios where, and particularly in features, you give the dev team a task, it takes them 3, 4, 5, even 10 days to do. And you can easily spend your 10 days on producing something that is 0 value, yet you can spend half a day on something which is incredibly high value. So what you can see as we go up, we get to a point around about here, which I think is quite interesting. You've done half the work, but you've got 23% extra value. You've done half the work, but you've delivered 72.7% of the value. And if we graph that out, I think that's going to work. There we go. Let me just quickly do this. Move that over there. What you can see, so the blue ones are the value, the orange ones are the work you've done, and then the grey line, which has got an interesting little curve on it, is the extra value. So if I go back to here, we've got kind of a sweet spot around about here somewhere. That means to me, clearly, again, please discuss or tell me if you see it differently. But what it means is you absolutely don't need to aim at delivering all the value immediately. And we know that your marginal benefit, if you aim at your sort of your 100%, it's really not that big. If you aim at delivering about 70, 80%, or shall we even say 50, 60% of the work, you've got huge, great benefits here. Thoughts, questions about that?
The law of diminishing returns, isn't it?
It's exactly what it is, and it's marginal cost as well.
Yeah.
Any more questions about that? Have you seen something like that before?
I've not seen the benefit part to it. I've seen yeah.
Okay, so let's what we're doing in 3 quite detailed slides here is saying, get all of the stuff that you want to deliver, order it by value, and keep taking them off the top. Now, it's a whole workshop. I can do a whole day's workshop about how to order by value. But basically, my favorite way of doing this is you sit down with a napkin and the stakeholder, and you can say, right, show me all the things you want, and say to them, right, put them in order of value, and they'll go, and then what you can say is right, please tell me if you could only have one of those items, which one do you want? Boom, and then they've told you the most valuable. And then you say, right, tell me again the most valuable one, and boom, and off you go. And eventually you'll get to a list, and you can say, right, well, imagine half of the dev team goes sick because they've got COVID. Give me 3 items that you can sacrifice. And you can really roughly approach it like that. It's like chipping away at a sculpture. So talking about, I want to get rid of this. How do I turn the blinking pen off? It doesn't want to turn off for me. Doesn't matter. Yeah, so I mentioned before that you need to establish your value framework. Now, there's a bunch of different ways to do this, and it's always contextual to the project. I would strongly suggest, and my experience is that this works best when you work really, really closely with the stakeholder community. In an agile scenario, this is where the product owner comes in, because they are responsible for gathering all the needs and the problems and and the requirements of the stakeholders, and distilling them so that the Scrum team can use them. But it's super important that you have this conversation, and it's variable as well. Expect this to be different it's always going to be different for different clients, and it's always going to be different for different projects, but having the framework matters a lot. So classic things that I've seen is return on investment, how much time is saved, how much cost is saved by the implementation. In things like web applications or normal applications or services, you've got user engagement or satisfaction or customer retention, transactions per unit time. And then one of the other ones, which I've seen recently actually, is how effectively are you keeping your boss off your back? Because sometimes, I don't know if you've seen this, tell me if you have, but somebody will come to you and ask you to implement something. And in fact, there's quite a lot of politics in there. And sometimes they don't even care about the details of it being implemented, but they care about it being seen to be progressing. Can you think of any other ways to order work by value that you've seen from recent work?
I think you could say the keep the boss off your back is also keeping the customer happy as well,
Exactly.
because
Exactly.
it would translate directly into a customer having a particular bee in their bonnet about wanting to see something.
Exactly. And this is the most pertinent thing I can say about this. All that theory about iron triangle and ordered backlogs and value, blah, blah, blah. Unfortunately, it's not that simple, because all that was really simple. Because your best laid plans are going to be killed by dependencies. So what do I mean by dependencies? So in the way in which I'm using dependencies here, it means things that need to be delivered in particular sequences. Now, it gets really complicated. Well, not complicated. Yeah, it is. It's not complex. It's complicated because there are so many types of dependencies and so much detail of dependencies. And most people, frankly, don't look into it and fall foul of it because of that. And just broadly speaking, when I work with software teams, there are three really, really common types of software dependencies. So I have what I call dev dependencies, test dependencies, and deployment dependencies. Dev dependencies is things that have relationships when they're being engineered. Test dependencies are typically things that have dependencies during the test phase. In other words, you can't test something until something else is in place. And then deployment dependencies, which is stuff that needs to have a relationship as it goes out. And then with all of those three, you've got three main types of dependencies. In other words, side to side, the work needs to carry on side to side. You've got start to start, and you've got end to end as well. In other words, you can't start the next one until the previous one finishes. And even just outlining it like that, I mean, what does that? Does that give us a 3x3 matrix, or is it 3 squared, or whatever it is? I can't remember. But there's a lot of dependencies in there. The reason I mention it is that you can do an amazing job of ordering your backlog, and you can split it into phases and blah, 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 blah. All of that will be as nothing if you don't overlay it with dependencies as well. And that's okay, because one of the key dependencies that it helps to think about in particularly things like fixed price projects is what needs to be shown to whom at what point. Questions on that? Cool. So let's move on to our fourth point, which is daily stand-ups and check-ins. So I'm sure you've all heard about these. These get used by dev teams. They're great. They have three purposes. Checking in on your progress. Well, there's two really. Checking in on your progress and finding blockers. I particularly like them for finding blockers. I kind of don't care about the checking progress bit. The magic in the daily stand-ups is that everybody says, right, I have this problem, and typically those problems will get resolved very quickly. They will definitely get surfaced immediately. Everybody knows about them, and they can get resolved immediately. In a fixed price project where it's super time critical, it's not even being able to resolve the blockers that matters. I would pretty strongly recommend that you do some form of stand-up, just so that if a blocker comes up, then you can do the expectation management within minutes, as opposed to firefighting a week later. Alongside that goes the concept of show and tells and frequent peer reviews. I think, Dill, we were discussing this the other night, and you said you do. Did you say you do 2 weekly show and tells with your customers typically?
Depending on depending on the time, possibly more than that or less than that, depending on the phase, but we try and aim for something like that.
Yeah. So the reason I've shown you the picture on the screen here is that it's they say the best presentations use stories, and this is a bit of a horror story actually. So when I was working, this was my second job in Iceland. I'd been there about 4 years, and I built this system. So it was a data system for taking fish measurements from salmon farms from the water onto a computer and making those graphs on the right hand side. All those graphs on the right hand side I made in SQL Server reporting services. It was loads of fun listening to days and days of Icelandic thrash metal. It was great fun. And at one point, we realized, I had a conversation with the two marketing dudes, and they said it would be great if we can put a Norwegian and an Icelandic and a Spanish user interface on this, because it was used in all those countries. Interestingly, they didn't choose to implement the Scottish language. I don't know why. And they said, great, it needs to work like this. I said, yeah. They said, can you do it? And I said, oh, I think so. And I went deep, and I spent 13 months of my life getting this working. And I had a horrible, horrible time with it. It was so difficult technically that it basically pushed me into depression. It was awful. And then at the end of it, I pretty much got it working. It was a bit ugly, but it worked. You could change language. And I'll never forget this. I went upstairs to the office. I called a meeting with them, went upstairs to the office. I put this on the screen. And I said, there you go, look, change language. And they went, what's that? I said, what do you mean? They said, what's that? I said, it's the language changer like you asked for. And they said, oh, no, it's way too late for that. Don't worry about that. We don't need that now. And that was it. That's 13 months of my life just gone. And the point here, of course, is that if we'd been doing show and tells every couple of weeks, and if I'd been doing peer reviews with them on the approach I was taking, we wouldn't have wasted all that time and money and emotional capacity from me. It was horrible. Okay, so let's summarize the approaches we're taking there. The Moscow allows you to focus on the valuable work. The ordered backlog allows you to deliver the right things first, to deliver fast. Knowing the value of your tasks comes by having a value framework. And I might suggest, please tell me if this is too bold, but I might suggest that engaging with a customer and even raising the subject of a value framework and asking to agree a value framework is quite a good professional thing to do. You know, if somebody came to me and started to talk about that, I'd be quite impressed. And then daily stand-ups and regular check-ins help you stay on course and not waste time going off course. Summarizing that, these are the most important parts. Have an ordered backlog. It's got to be driven by frequent customer input, and it's got to account for the dependencies that we discussed there. Continually validate what you've done, what you're assuming, and that means technical validation, and it means user validation as well. And do short increments. The short increments goes with the other 2 points there. Any questions on that? Okay, so there is a bunch of other stuff that you can do as well. I'm not going to go into details on them. They're all available. I'd be happy to discuss any of them at any time. And this sort of collection of tools or concepts, if you like, makes up the whole sort of ecosystem of best practice and agile delivery. So retrospectives, you might have heard of these. So if you're doing your show and tells, come off the back of those, allow the team to talk to themselves. And the key bit here is the action points. I've seen so many retros wasted because you don't pick up the action points. One of my favorite ways that this gets expressed is that the show and tell is where you inspect the what you've delivered. You inspect the product. In the retro, you inspect the how. You inspect the process, the how you did it. And then hopefully you'll avoid mistakes. Acceptance criteria are great. It's a checklist, a pre-flight list, if you like to make sure the thing's actually been done how you said. Alongside the acceptance criteria, I really like those because they are the guardians against scope creep. And just to clarify what I mean here, scope creep is when usually the customer, not always, but usually the customer tries to do more stuff than you had agreed, or they tries to force you to do more stuff than you've agreed. And it's usually preceded by the words, oh, can you just? And I like to joke that, you know, every person has a limited quota of the word just. And of course, thinking back to the iron triangle, the fastest way that you can kill a project is by allowing scope to creep. And a great technique for stopping that is by having fixed acceptance criteria, which means you're saying, it's going to do this, 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 and this. It will not do this, this, and this. And that has to be agreed. It's worth mentioning, by the way, almost every engineering team I've worked with, from the worst through to the most brilliant, always have the problem of what I call autoscope creep, which is basically where engineer enthusiasm allows them to go, or forces them to go rampaging off, and they forget that they're trying to work in a structured environment. That's why not all engineers really thrive in an agile way. Spikes and time boxes I like a lot because they are, I mean, even in the best of projects, you're still going to have questions that need answering, because somebody will say, right, I need you to integrate that with that. And in the bid, of course, you're going to say, yeah, it's going to be done. And of course, you're never going to say that it can't be done. If you want to prove it, then use a spike, use a time box. The spike is a formulated question where you would have acceptance criteria on it. And typically, a spike has 3 standard acceptance criteria. 1, answer this question, put the details of the question. 2, write up your results and get them peer reviewed. 3, write up the requirements that allow the implementation of the thing that you were checking. And the time box goes hand in hand with the spike. Typically, you would say, right, put 2 days on it, put 3 days on it, or whatever. And the key bit there is not the number. It's got to be short, never really more than a week. The key bit there is that at the end of it, the team member who, or the two, maybe you've paired on it, the team members that were doing the spike will stand up in the daily stand up and say, right, everybody, we finished our spike. We've discovered this, 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 or this. This is what we're going to do. And maybe you'll have a short conversation about it. Sometimes they'll say, right, yeah, we've burnt through our time box. We've realized this, this, and this, but we need a bit more time to come to the conclusion here. Can I have another couple of days? And off you go. So they're super valuable for that. Definition of ready and done is kind of the same as acceptance criteria. I'm not going to go into detail on it now because that's agile theory. Work in progress limits are actually not that relevant to this. I should have taken it off. Context switching is a defense mechanism, or avoidance of context switching is a defense mechanism that stops your developers wasting their time. Classic example of that is, don't expect developers to be productive if they're trying to do client account management or support at the same time they're implementing something, and vice versa. And then continuous delivery or DevOps, CI/CD. It's so valuable, and I had a conversation about this with somebody a couple of days ago where they were saying the big problem with DevOps and CI/CD is that it's always software engineers that explain it, and they say, oh, it's great, you can do this and the pull request and blah blah blah, and that doesn't really answer it in the right way. DevOps and CI and CD, they exist for one reason, and that is to get the solutions to people's problems into their hands as fast as you possibly can. So as soon as you solve the problem, you want absolutely no delay whatsoever between the creation of the solution and putting it in their hands and saying, right, what do you think? It's about fast feedback. That's why continuous delivery is great.
Just on top of that,
yeah.
The other thing, the way I sort of talk about it with my customers is actually it helps employee well-being.
I agree,
because you know that, okay, it takes a bit of time, but eventually you know it's just going to work. Exactly. And it just takes that stress. Oh shit, I've got to deploy this.
And this is what's so beautiful about it, because when you're doing DevOps right, we know that you've got automated systems, you've got high levels of unit test coverage. I mean, even if you read Investments Unlimited, brilliant book, they even talk about pipelines as code, compliance as code. Mm-hmm. You can put all these beautiful automated gates up. And what that means, of course, you've got 2 things there. One is the engineering team, a delivery team, doesn't need to worry about quality. It's all being done for them. And secondly, like you say, instead of using their brain power worrying about whether or not they're going to break the build or kill production, they can use their brain power to do that thing that delivery teams need to do. Find creative solutions and do brilliant work. It's a really good point. And then finally, source control and shared knowledge. This is probably one of the bigger mistakes or sort of omissions that I see teams do. Most organizations are rubbish at sharing knowledge, even though you've got incredible tools like SharePoint and Confluence and all the rest of it. And it's usually an absence of understanding and an absence of coaching that they have. And the key bit here, of course, is that if you have got your knowledge shared nicely and you're doing source control properly, it's just so much more time efficient. The big thing here, of course, is, I mean, that's a huge, great list of things, and each of those is like half a day workshop or more, just go and ask an Agile coach. Because any half decent Scrum Master or any experienced Agile coach will be able to talk you through and guide you and mentor you through all of this. Any questions on any of those?
Yeah, I think I mean something which we definitely suffer in our business is context switching.
Yeah,
and it's because we don't have we don't have a big enough team, actually. That's probably what it is. So then people, Stuart, who's on the call, he's wearing multiple hats.
It's tough. It's super tough. And it absolutely slaughters productivity. I mean, I've had situations where I was Scrum Mastering where I had to, and this is back in the, do you remember those days when we used to go to those funny things called offices? Do you remember those? When we were all, physically doing daily stand-ups, and I'd have a team of like 8 or 10 engineers, and I'd have all these blustery account manager types, and I used to physically put my desk between the dev team and the rest of the company so that I could see if anybody was about to walk over and talk to an engineer. I would stand up and do my best rugby player thing and go, right, can I help you? And I do this thing of having really, really aggressive body language, but a big smile and a polite voice at the same time. And it used to freak them out. And the amount of productivity I saved by physically preventing context switching, it was great. And of course, the dev team used to love it and buy me beers at the end of the day for that, because they'd had a good day at work.
Can I?
Yeah, go on.
Can I be the devil's advocate here?
Please do.
And this is probably me being argumentative for the sake of stimulating discussion.
Stick with the tradition.
If the reverse of context switching is for somebody to be very, very siloed.
Absolutely. And there's very much a balance to find there.
Yes.
And context switching is not one of those, I mean, like so many of these things, there's no numbers on it. It's a concept. And what it basically means is let them get on with their work. But that doesn't mean they're going to be sitting for 37 and a half hours a week doing exactly the same thing without ever communicating to people. And of course, as you quite rightly say, Agile abhors silos. So how do we overcome that? Well, this is actually one of these conversations I have with a lot of teams about ways of working. And typically when I pick up a new team, we'll do a week or two of discovery. I follow them through ceremonies. We'll look at what they're doing, how they're doing it, and then we'll do a social contract. And the social contract talks about, are there silos? Are there blockers? What's the context switching? What time of day do you want your daily stand-up? What time of day do you want your refinement? Do you want to block some time out so you have no meetings and nobody's going to respond to Teams during this time? And you're quite right. It's absolutely not a maximization or a minimization algorithm. It's one of those optimization things.
Yeah, because obviously during COVID, when people were working at home and there was a certain amount of time in which people would have stand-ups, etc. The problem is that most organizations, I think, discovered this, that you lost situational awareness of what other teams were doing. So you'd be very, very focused on your particular job, great for productivity, but you'd have no awareness of strategy, what other teams were doing, whether there was lessons from other teams, etc.
Yeah. And interestingly, Hargreaves Lansdowne, that I've just been working with for a couple of years, they came up with quite a good response to that. I'm sure a lot of organizations have done this. So they came up with the idea of a digital village hall, which when I first went to them, I thought was a bit trite and a bit silly. But actually, I ended up on the team that was running the village halls. And this was the opportunity, because they've got something like 27 dev teams there. It's massive. This was the opportunity to do exactly what you're talking about there. It evolved as the antidote to that sort of lack of information flow. And it became really good. We used to have like 350 people turning up to them once a month, and they were a complete free-for-all. And they were super valuable in that respect, and loads of little tertiary conversations used to spring off them as well. So yeah, I completely understand what you're saying.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because Microsoft have put a lot of effort into employee engagement. So they're trying to build tools to facilitate this. And it is basically the reverse of the siloing you need to do in order to be productive on your particular project.
Exactly.
It's all this content to distract people.
I find it interesting because it's kind of, it shows us the way in which the world of work is continually evolving around us. And I personally am still learning this as well. Okay, any more questions on that before we wrap up? Cool. So we've got some reading here. The really important one here is Twice the Work, Half the Time by Jeff Sutherland, who's one of the creators of Scrum. Scrum.org is awesome. Team of Teams is not specifically about what we've dealt with here, but I can't recommend it enough. It's a brilliant, brilliant book. And I have got, I think, let me just check here. Yeah, it's about 20 links here. So like, what is Agile, getting started with Agile project management, how to do estimation, reference for the Moscow, product backlogs, all sorts of other stuff. And I will share those with you. I'd strongly commend those to you. And this is me, 14th of February. That's what I was doing. Any questions? Anybody who can identify where that is wins an extra prize from me. Any questions?
No, thank you very much.
Yeah, interesting you cited Team of Teams, because in there, essentially his lesson was that the US Army in Iraq was a massive and monolithic organization, and they were up against people who were very agile.
Correct.
Extremely barbaric and very, very good at what they did.
Very agile, yeah.
But they were the very definition of agile.
Yes, exactly. And they were anti-monolithic.
Yes, that's what I was saying, that he was rather admiring of the people he fought against, that, you know, they were pretty brutal about how they went about things, but they were the ultimate agile teams.
Effective. Yeah, and I mean to extend that idea, if you look at the things that the US Army was trying to do and how they were trying to do them, there was this really, really obvious difference with what the was it Al Qaeda? It was Al Qaeda, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, they were fighting against several different groups, but he was particularly concerned with Al Qaeda.
So the US Army would have said, here is our massive monolithic objective. We're breaking it down into these huge, great long phases. Whereas Al Qaeda was literally operating day to day, and their timelines for operational planning were probably days or weeks. And instead of having one or few huge, great monolithic objectives, they probably had lots and lots and lots of tiny little objectives. And you know, Afghanistan's a classic example of that as well, because what really, really hurt the Allied forces in Afghanistan was not one huge great thing, but this constant attrition of improvised explosive devices all the time. It's really interesting.
And likewise, you could see that the Russian military in Ukraine is
same again.
They're very much the monolithic organization.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
So they were prepared for operational secrecy, they were basically prepared to sacrifice any amount of flexibility.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Any more questions about what we've covered there? Thoughts? I mean, the main thing is, how relevant do you feel that is to your worlds of fixed pricey type stuff?
Yeah, no, it is.
One or two things.
Yeah, no, it's very, very, very relevant. It's sometimes, you know, some of these things, you know, I've heard before, and kind of you forget about them, don't you? You know, so
I know.
You know, so you're being reminded of them, and then just kind of going, oh yeah, you know, actually, if we do this, this will help reduce the risk, and then, you know, then really, really useful. No, thank you.
Yeah,
and good stories to tell, because I, you know, one of the things that I do find is when you can explain to a customer why, and then back it up with a story, that really helps kind of cement and get their trust, you know, because that's what we're, you know, we're trying to be trusted partners with our customers.
Definitely.
So,
yeah. The value framework stuff was really, really powerful. So if you're going to do this talk again, riffing on that and exemplifying that a bit more would be really, really useful, because you could illustrate.
Thank you. And maybe some case studies of that would dig nicely deeper into it, because when you talk about value frameworks, it does feel abstract. I'm sure most people can imagine it, but personally, I tend to my style of learning is that I really grasp things best when I have a practical illustration of it in front of me.
Well, if you could illustrate that with a story where it turns out that the first thing you wanted to do isn't the most valuable, isn't the.
But it's funny. It's funny you say that, actually, because when we did the Star Alliance deal, we had a couple of classic examples of that. There were two features that Star Alliance asked for right at the very inception of it, and it almost was a fixed price project. It was certainly fixed in deadlines. There were these two features that they all the way through, the director of customer experience, Christian, kept saying, no, we must have this, we must have this, we must have this. About I think it was a year later, they signed off the entire deal for us, saying, "Yeah, great, this is going to go live, and the system is live now." Those two features never got into production because nobody cared about them enough. They got superseded by other things, and nobody ever complained.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful lesson there, because where the sweet spot on there isn't necessarily the thing that the customer is most concerned about. And you can use that as a way to justify why you're not doing it.
And of course, it's all related, because the ordering of the backlog, the contents of the value framework, and the actual valuing of the individual items, that's not static. And I guess I might have emphasized this more, actually. If you think that you can succeed in fixed price projects by making all those decisions once and never again, then that's not the right way to think about it. If you really, really want to find a way to succeed in that scenario, do a great stab up front, but keep checking in with the customer. Is this still top of your backlog? Is that still most valuable for you? Do you still think you can do without that? And once you have the expectation of, I don't know, every 2 weeks or every month, checking in with them and questioning your assumptions, that's where things are not going to slip through the cracks.
Tim, one of the things. Hiya, I work for Simon, so one of the things I hope Simon doesn't mind saying this. One of the things I struggle a bit with is in DevOps is some of the stuff in there as user stories is stuff that I've thought of,
Yes.
As I'm developing, I think, oh yeah, what about this? Well, what about, oh, that's not quite right. What about, oh, maybe we should do it. Oh, that needs thinking about. And of course, we'll check with the customer can see that sprint or that backlog or whatever it is. I'll still check it with them and make sure that they think that's a good something that does need considering. And obviously, I'll speak to Simon and the team about it as well. But then I sometimes think, well, maybe I shouldn't be doing that. It's just up to the customer to decide exactly what they need. But like in my past job, I found the internal customer, as it was, very much they needed constantly steering. They often didn't, and so I suppose it's like a habit of a lifetime, really. They often not entirely sure what. Well, they do. They kind of know, but they don't know the detail. So you sometimes have to suggest the detail for them. So
I've seen that a lot, and very, very often the only thing that the customer knows is the problem, and they know what the pain is. They don't even sometimes know what the solution would look like. They just know that they're bleeding out here and they want it fixed. And I think, just to clarify, when you say you've seen it in DevOps, I think you're talking about Azure DevOps, the tool there, aren't you?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So you're probably using that as your work control tool.
Yeah.
I thought so. Yeah.
So
that makes perfect sense. Are you?
Simon sometimes tells me off because I put user stories and put a question mark after them, and he's like, "What's all these question marks?" And they're things that I think, well, maybe we need to think about that, But
there's an easy approach to that. There's a super easy approach to that. Go into Azure DevOps, find everything and there's two things you can do here, right? Find everything with a question mark, put it straight to the bottom of the backlog. Everything straight to the bottom of the backlog, and then, as soon as you get a chance, do a scoping and refinement session, which is purely about the question marks, and just be really ruthless with yourself. Go in there and say, right, we're going to take an hour and a half or 2 hours, and we're going to go through as many of those as we can and just prune it. And you'll be shocked at how much dross you get rid of.
Yeah, good idea. Yeah, and hopefully the client doesn't just think you're making stuff up to get more work out of them. That's always at the back of my mind as well.
And again, this is I recognise that this is where the frequent check-ins and I think, Simon, like you're saying, the trust relationship is super important, because the more open you can be with them, the more powerful it's going to be. I mean, even to the extent where we've had scenarios where we just give them read-only access to Jira or Azure DevOps or whatever it is, so they can literally see what we're doing. And inviting them to show and tells, it's
tricky, isn't it? Because you put them in because you see them as potentially being issues further down the line. So that's that. Yeah, but it's not. It's just. I think that's a good idea. Right at the bottom of the backlog.
And I guess there's, with a lot of these projects that I've seen, there's kind of, at the risk of oversimplifying this, there's one huge great thing that really has such a strong influence on the outcome of the deal, and that is the fact that what we are doing as IT professionals, as IT delivery professionals, we are trying to solve a problem by using IT to do that, and we're solving a problem for people who are not IT people, and they're not IT specialists, and they don't understand how we do it. In the same way that when I go to the dentist and get her to fix my teeth, I don't understand what she knows about my teeth. And what that means is that the people that we deal with in these organizations, our clients, they have assumptions, they have gaps in their knowledge, they might have opinions, or even, very often strong feelings about it as well. Now, when I was early in IT, I used to experience that in a negative sense, because I used to get frustrated with them, and I used to resent their ignorance, and I would be quite pejorative about them. As I've sort of got a bit more sensible, I realized that that's where the opportunity is. That's our opportunity to go in there, accept the fact that they are coming from a different background, work out what they know, what they don't know, how they feel, how they don't feel. And it's like the FUD thing as well. They may well be having a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt in there. And the way we can help is to just gently take them by the hand and to take them on that journey. It's almost a parental nurturing thing that we have to do. Because I've seen quite often in big deals or business critical scenarios when this FUD comes up, that can sometimes manifest itself as quite unacceptable or unpleasant behaviors from clients, and we can mitigate that by doing a great job of looking after them through the deal.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Any other questions from anybody? I'm really disappointed that I haven't managed to raise any controversy. I sometimes, if I get bored, I'll put a slide in that is really controversial just to get a reaction from the audience, but I haven't got any of that today at all.
I tried to get you with the silos one, but
ain't gonna happen. And nobody cares about the environmental impact of fish farming either. I'd mentally prepared my answers to that when I went to the post office.
Stuart will have a comment on this.
Yeah, eat mussels instead of fish. They're apparently much more environmentally friendly.
That's because they're filter feeders. Yeah. So, fun fact of the day. So there's a thing called feed conversion ratio. Do we know what that is? It's basically how many kilos of feed you have to put in to get 1 kilo of protein out. And the feed conversion ratio for beef is about 23 to 1. So to get a kilo of beef, you need to put about 23 kilos of food in. And it's about the same with water as well. You need something like 25 liters of water. And the feed conversion ratio for salmon is 1.04. It's just about the most efficient way that you can get protein back out. Because of course, I didn't realize this until I started working with fish farms, and I went and visited a couple of fish farms in Scotland as well. It's fascinating. So of course they're cold-blooded. They don't need to heat themselves. They don't need energy for that, and they're being supported by the water, so they don't need energy to perambulate in the way that bovines do. And of course, they're always in the water, so you don't need to go adding loads and loads of water in there. And basically, if you can avoid the negative sides of fish farming, like parasites and polluting the sea floor, it's an incredibly efficient way of getting protein back out for not much money and feed.
So you just need to figure out a way of making it taste like beef.
Yes, exactly. But it all tastes like chicken anyway, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's a shame Simon Hudson isn't here. He's passionate about environment and everything. Yeah,
don't get me started on that. What I'm going to say is don't believe everything you read in the press. Well, I hope that's helpful.
No, it's really
Very
helpful.
thought-provoking.
Yeah,
good.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, no, it's really good. I'm just apologise.
Yeah, thanks.
More people here to listen to it.
Well,
Yeah,
I'm perfectly happy to do another one or repeat this. I've got about 7 of these lined up that I can do at the drop of the hat. I did a fun one at HL a few months ago, which was it's 15 minutes long, and it was about real world Agile. And it was one of the stories in there was me and Dylan trying to climb a mountain in Scotland and failing gloriously, and going and climbing something else instead.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm involved in this maturity model for Microsoft 365, and I do wonder how if there's aspects of this kind of stuff to talk through, because in this practitioner session, and it's a global community effort. We have about sort of generally about 60 or 70 people attend each month, and But like, it's really, one thing we don't really get to talk about is, well, the actual how you get this stuff delivered, and
Yeah.
I think it'd be an interesting one. I'll pitch it to the team actually.
Do please do, because the reason I emphasize so much on this is that very often to me it feels like it's the incredibly important but hidden thing. It's a bit like in the workplace or in certain professions. You've got a couple of huge great things which are incredibly powerful and hidden, like for example psychology, communication, and body language and non-verbal communication. In some roles these are the job, like in nursing or healthcare or teaching or coaching. These are the job, but to most people these are just either completely opaque or quite absent. And this whole stuff about how to get software features, or how to solve problems using software, and how to do it properly and predictably, to me it feels like another one of those, because so few people understand it. When you get outside the rarefied atmosphere of Agile coaching and Scrum Masters, so few people understand it. And I meet so many people, and I'm not saying this in a negative sense at all, and I'm sure it's just a numbers game, but I meet so many people who come from the background of traditional project management, and they struggle because they don't understand why traditional project management doesn't survive the incredibly challenging environment of software.
Yeah.
It's interesting though, isn't it? I mean, I live opposite this old quarry, Woodside Quarry, and they're building a housing estate in there for the past year or two, and it's amazing seeing how they've landscaped it to build houses, because it was just a big old quarry with big holes and massive cliff faces and things, and and you kind of think, well, is every quarry that they build in more or less the same? How do they go about deciding how they're going to do that and project managing it, because they must hit all sorts of issues as they're trying to landscape and prepare the land.
They do, and in fact, there was, I think it's called, I think there's a Radio 4 program about business called, I think it's called The Bottom Line.
Yeah, it is The Bottom Line.
Really, really, really interesting. And a few years ago, I listened to a fascinating one about the construction industry, and they were talking in there increasingly about agility, because it's super challenging for them, because
that's where I was going with it. They must hit lots of big issues as they're going. They do.
Because there are, and I should really look into this a bit more, because at the core of the need for agility is the fact that estimation is incredibly difficult. I've deliberately not gone into estimation tonight in detail because we don't have time, but I can do another hour on that if you needs to be. And it's this combination of estimation being difficult and plans not surviving contact with the real world. Now, in the construction industry, what they were saying is that estimation is usually not too much of a problem, because you've got lots of precedents and you can be quite empirical with it. But even really, really well-informed estimates don't necessarily survive contact with the real world, with things like all of your expat workers from Eastern Europe needing to leave the country, or global pandemics, or wars. So it's a really interesting blend of both sides.
And the other good one I read about recently was, the famous Bay Bridge in San Francisco. Not the Golden Gate Bridge, the other one, the Bay
this
Bridge.
Was Tacoma Narrows. Yeah, the wobbly.
So there was that earthquake in '89, so they decided to, the Bay Bridge needed replacing, and eventually they built a new one alongside it, and then they dismantled the old one. And the Bay Bridge, famously, it has an island in the middle, so it's actually two bridges.
Treasure Island. I've been there actually.
Oh, interesting.
Big naval base.
So it's the bridge over to Oakland, isn't it? Yeah, and apparently it was billions over budget building this bridge, and it was something like 10 years late. And you think to yourself, well, people building bridges, surely you'd think they'd more or less, get it closer than that. They more or less know what they're doing. But it was just hampered with all sorts of problems, and apparently now there's still problems with it, because the steel they've used is not right. You know, it's poor quality steel.
Yeah.
So they're now having to replace a lot of the steel work in it. So yeah, it's been hampered with all sorts of problems right from the beginning. And a similar thing, isn't it? You'd think people building bridges and project managers of building bridges and everything, they'd know what they were doing, and it would more or less.
Well, you're hitting on one.
It wouldn't go that badly wrong, I suppose. Is what I'm saying.
You're hitting on one of my favorite subjects here. I do maybe. When's your next one of these, Simon? Because I do a sort of I think it's 15-20 minute presentation about software disasters.
Oh right, okay.
Most of them are systemic failures, and they relate back to exactly this. Actually, it's projects going woefully wrong.
Yeah. We've got Leon is coming to do a session on Microsoft Syntax in March, and then I think I'm talking next.
Yeah,
Tim, you can do a you can do a you can do a session. That would be fantastic.
I'll be your warm-up act. How about that?
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah,
I'd love to. It's a really fun little presentation, and I've got about a third of the number of examples that I would like to use, but not too much of a spoiler. But surprise, surprise, human frailty and humans being rubbish is the common thread that runs through it all. And in fact, on some of them, it's actually human arrogance. And it involves, my favorite bit is that it involves blowing up space hardware. And you get this thing where people think, oh well, it's only software, it won't go wrong. Look up a machine called the Therac 25. That killed tens of people, that X-ray machine, before they realized what was going wrong with it. It's crazy. I won't spoil it, but let's do this.
Yeah, just ask Boeing about software failures never hurting anybody.
Exactly. Did you see the documentary about that?
I didn't, but yeah.
Watch it. It's shocking. If
that's the thing, though, isn't it? Embedded systems, used in military hardware and that. I mean, obviously, it's well tested, and it usually, I think, mostly works, doesn't it?
Theoretically, yes.
You're
talking to the right person because I used to be a user of that equipment, and my one of the guys that was in one of my teams is an embedded software engineer as well. And the funny thing is that for the longest time, some of the worst code that you could find and the least structured stuff was embedded, because they were so incredibly constrained on their resources. Like these no, it's not a SIM card, is it? No, SIM cards had like 128k on them or something crazy, so they were basically back into the days of the early 80s. But it's got a great deal better now, because you can do it, and you could even do it agile, but you need the right approach to it.
I suppose with military stuff, it's just the money and lots of resource thrown at it until it's absolutely spot on. I guess. Yeah. I did
an interview actually at the Pilatus aircraft company in Switzerland. That was quite interesting. I interviewed for a coding job there, and they gave me a tour of the factory. And what they told me was that all of their aircraft run off software. It's all embedded flight control systems and nav systems and everything. And the software all the time is what they call sealed. So you have a version and it is completely sealed up. And for the aircraft to be allowed to fly, the software has to be certified as safe to fly. And whether you change one character in one line of code or 4,000 lines of code, that certification, each time you do it, costs $2 million. So any change to the code is $2 million if you want the aircraft to keep flying. And that kind of, I should dig into the project management around this a little bit more, but that kind of completely shifts the center of gravity of project management around.
Well, that would stop me putting my user stories with question marks at the end.
Well, exactly.
Sure.
Yeah, and you're not going to have a patch Tuesday with that sort of system, are you?
Exactly.
And it's interesting that as things connect to the internet, if it's so expensive and difficult to recertify the software, how do you keep up with changes? Like if you discover a security vulnerability in your embedded system, it's going to be there for a couple of years.
Yeah, my answer to that is that any certification process that takes costs $2 million is probably ripe for improvement, because if you take a normal CI/CD/DevOps model or a DevSecOps model, it should cost pennies to recertify the entire code base. I mean, I've got some code here that I'm writing at the moment. It's about, I don't know, it's about 7,000 lines of code, and I can test the entire code base in 1 minute and 30 seconds, and I can have a coffee while it's doing it automatically. So it's probably just that they're doing it in legacy ways, you know.
But it's a valid point, because in the automotive industry, typically your car has software and it stays with the car for the life of it.
Not if you're talking about my old
updated.
Clio. I bought a new Renault Clio in 2002, and it I used to have to reboot it. So if I went round a roundabout at just the wrong speed and changed gear at the wrong time, the engine would stop. And the only way to make it start again was I used to have to turn it off, start the engine up again, and off you go. And it didn't do to just, you know, crank the engine. I used to have to turn the whole thing off and back on again. And I took it back to the dealer. They put the next version in, ping, immediately fixed. I had to literally reboot the car.
Yeah, whereas they're having problems with over-the-air updates, aren't they? Because I think Tesla had a problem recently, and then it's like, wait a minute, we're going to deploy a patch, which is nuts if you think about how the automotive industry used to work.
I can't remember which aircraft it was, but there was one that fell foul. In fact, it's in, where is it? Oh no, I gave it to, what's his name? There's a brilliant book called Humble Pie, where they talk about an aircraft that needed to be rebooted at every 100 flight hours because one of the timers was running out of space in its variable space.
I saw that actually. Yeah, you basically
really
have you tried turning the plane on and off again?
Yeah, and that's exactly what they had to do. It's like every fourth sortie, they'd get to Berlin or whatever, and it was like, and we're good to go for another 100 flight hours.
Yeah,
can you imagine? It's the opposite of what we used to have to do with the Sea Kings, because Sea Kings absolutely loved flying all the time. As long as you keep the engines going, as long as you keep the rotors turning all the time, just keep pumping fuel into it, it'll do hundreds and hundreds of flight hours. But as soon as you shut it down and try and start it up again, it just pisses fuel and oil all over the place. So that's what the Royal Navy used to do. You just chuck a bunch more crew and fuel in it and keep going. The RAF used to think we were mad, because they would never refuel a helicopter on the ground with the rotors turning. They used to think it was way too dangerous.
It's the same, isn't it, with things like hard disks? You know, as soon as you turn the server off, you know, everything seizes up. The fact is, it'll keep going as long as it's not switched off.
Yeah. Do you remember back in the day, there was always the server that must never be turned off because you weren't sure that it would restart correctly? There was always one machine in the back, and it's like, whatever you do, don't reboot that machine.
I spoke to I had two instances of this, right? And these are both true stories, right, from my early days in IT. One was there was a guy working on a database system for a developer I know, working on one of the database systems for one of the largest retail companies in Reykjavik. And they had an Oracle database server that had just been running for years and years and years and years. And then they needed to do some physical update on it. And it took him a week to find the server. And he asked everybody in the company, and of course the staff are changing over in the company. Nobody could find the bloody server. And eventually what he ended up doing was grabbing one of the network engineers and tracing the cables all the way back by going through the patch panels and everything. And they discovered that there was a cable right in the back of the server room that disappeared into a wall. And somebody had just built an MDF wall around this server and just boxed it in, and it had just been sitting there running all the time.
Walled in.
Completely. It's a walled in server. And the opposite of that, as I had a customer, this was a healthcare provider that I was working for down in Worthing or somewhere. And they this is so stupid, it's true as well. They kept complaining that their system kept going offline, and I spent hours and hours on phone calls with them. And then eventually I drove 3 hours down there to go and find them, only to discover that the machine running the system was right next to the coffee boat. And every time somebody made a cup of tea, they'd unplug the server and plug the kettle in. It was so stupid.
The classic one, I think it's a .NET Rocks on the team. They talk about that this server would go down at like 5:30 every day.
Yeah.
It was the cleaner unplugging the server, plugging
back in.
It's like a legend, that one, isn't it?
Humans. See, back to humans again. It's take the humans out of the system, and it'll be great.
Take the users out of the system, even better. Yeah.
Exactly. ID10T problems. Right, I better cruise.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Very informative, and that value measuring